I want to begin by thanking my old friend, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, for inviting me to speak to this conference. It was an act of reckless folly on his part. And lest I be accused of coming here on false premises, I think he well knows that I am in a state of almost total ignorance about the technical details of nuclear issues, about arms control issues, or disarmament issues. My approach has always been a political one, or indeed perhaps even a psychological one. It is a fundamental liberal belief, a very touching liberal belief, that everyone shares one's own beliefs, or at least ought to share one's own beliefs, or can be made to share one's own beliefs. And the belief in the possibility of a nuclear weapon-free world is one manifestation of this delusion, and a particularly dangerous one. It would be extremely wrong to assume that the attractiveness or the desirability of an idea has any correlation with its correctness. And when an erroneous but attractive idea is propagated by very eminent personalities, as the idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone has been propagated, it becomes even more dangerous. And indeed, the more worthy the idea and the more eminent its proponents, the greater the dangers. A nuclear weapon-free world, or even the idea of nuclear weapon-free zones, are examples of such ideas. And the greatest danger in the practice, and I emphasize the practice of diplomacy or international relations is self-deception or wishful thinking. And let me illustrate this with reference to a specific example, which I'm sure is on everybody's minds, and that is the Ukraine. If there were no Budapest Memorandum, the probability is, indeed I will go so far as to say the high probability would be, that Crimea would still be part of the Ukraine. And there are many other examples to show that states that give up nuclear arsenals, or even the intention to acquire nuclear arsenals, do so at their own peril. The NPT is a weak reed on which to base any country's fundamental security, and even a weaker reed, and I hope Rakesh will forgive me, after the US-India nuclear deal. And so also are nuclear weapon-free zones weak reeds. I say this on some authority because I have been involved for many years in the elaboration of one such zone in our own region, the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, on which more later. But the lesson of the Ukraine is a deeper one than just the trite observation that, if it had nuclear weapons, Russia could not have acted, probably would not have acted the way it did. There is a deeper lesson. It was obvious to anybody with the slightest familiarity with Russian foreign policy or the history of the region, that Russia could not indefinitely acquiesce in Ukraine drifting towards the west without losing some essential part of itself. Russia was bound to react in some way. How precisely was not known, but it was bound to react. When what was only unknown was how specifically it would react. The West, in particular the EU, perhaps for its own reasons, could not conceive that President Putin would react in the way he eventually did. And because they could not themselves conceive of themselves acting in such a way, they discounted the very possibility of that behavior. And the price was paid by the Ukraine. It was utterly feckless and irresponsible to have encouraged Ukraine without either the ability to deter a Russian response or to impose significant costs after it did response. The West was completely blindsided by what happened in recent months and reacted with shock and surprise. Why? For the reasons, the psychological reasons that I have mentioned. Not being able to conceive of a particular behavior in their own circumstances, they discounted it in other circumstances. After the annexation of the Crimea, Russian behavior was called unacceptable 19th century behavior in the 21st century. Well, perhaps. But the assumption was that Russia shared the West's assumption of what was acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And this assumption that Russia shared the Western assumptions was irresponsible and delusional. During the Cold War, I will grant that the West, in particular the US and the then Soviet Union, shared certain basic assumptions. But this is no longer true. And this is particularly no longer true of the new nuclear weapon states, the DPRK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and potentially Iran. A book that I think such distinguished experts as you must have read by Paul Brecken, The Second Nuclear Age, made a very fundamental point, that the greatest risks in what he calls the second nuclear age are in the regions, not at the global level. And that the strategic calculations in the regions, the strategic priorities, and hence the strategic behaviors of regional nuclear powers, and Russia I would count among them now, because Russia is now primarily a regional power, are very different from the calculations that pertained during the Cold War. And the calculations of the new nuclear powers cannot be divorced from their specific regional context. What, for example, has the regional context of the Middle East or South Asia or East Asia for that matter have to do with the global calculations that existed during the Cold War? Very little, I would maintain. I'll speak a little bit more about this later. A nuclear weapon-free world assumes, very wrongly in my view, that all nuclear weapon states still share common assumptions, including the common assumption that a nuclear weapon-free world is desirable. Because if it was so desirable, why would some of these states undergo considerable sacrifice in order to acquire nuclear weapons? Whether they are wrong or right in their assumptions is completely irrelevant. What is relevant is they believe it, and they have acted on their beliefs. Well, I do hope that Ukraine's unhappy fate will spark a strategic revaluation. I think Dr. Sethi mentioned that Russia and China have embarked on significant modernizations of their nuclear forces, and the US is lagging behind. I believe, was it last year, that the US announced a rather large sum of money in order for modernization. But with the specific political and fiscal circumstances, whether this will actually come to pass is still, to my mind, an open question. Possibly what happened in Ukraine may make it slightly more likely that it will come to pass. I think I should draw your attention to the fact that the most active and eminent proponents of a nuclear weapon-free world, with one notable exception, are all retired. I am reminded of a saying attributed to Saint Augustine: "Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet." So, Lord, make me chaste, but not until I'm retired. And the main proponents of a nuclear weapon-free world are Western. I know of no Chinese proponent of a nuclear weapon-free world, no significant Chinese proponent of that eminence of those in the West, the George Shultz or the Henry Kissinger or William Perry, and I know of no Russian proponent. Perhaps Gorbachev, but then Gorbachev is well known for his failures, not for his successes. Well, when we discuss such issues, nuclear weapon-free zone, and I am all for discussion of such issues, thorough discussion, I think we must not lose sight that there is a fundamental difference between the values and attitudes of those who hold the responsibility of decision and those who merely have the responsibility of commenting on those who hold the responsibility of decision. And this is a difference that I hope these discussions will not lose sight of. Let me conclude by underlining what I hope my remarks have already made obvious. I was supposed to speak on the specific topic of deterrence and stability on the road to nuclear zero. And one of the conference organizers asked me to address specifically how stability at high levels of weapons holdings can be distinguished from stability at low levels of weapons holdings, and how stability at both levels can be maintained. Well, I'm not qualified to speak on this because, as I said at the beginning, these are technical issues. And so are the verification challenges that the second lot of speakers will speak about. These are important issues, please don't misunderstand me. But they are essentially technical issues. And the problem I have been trying to speak about, my perspective of this is essentially a political one. And there cannot be technical solutions to political problems. The essential issue is the mismatch of logics. The false assumption that everyone shares the same logic and that sees the desirability of a common end. And this is essentially, as I said, a political and psychological problem to which there are no technical solutions. And now, let me illustrate this by saying a few words on a specific case which I mentioned earlier, the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. The Schonfest, as we call it in ASEAN, has quite long antecedents. In 1971, ASEAN signed a declaration to establish what we call ZOFAN, a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality in Southeast Asia. And we in Singapore were part of it reluctantly. Indeed, to be very frank, we were part of it because we thought it was harmless. ZOFAN was based on a false premise that regional security, at least security in our region, was best assured by excluding major powers. But this forgot one inconvenient fact, that there was at least one major power that was geographically contiguous to our region and therefore could not be excluded. Our conclusion was that rather than having a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality, peace and stability in Southeast Asia was best assured by a balance of major powers rather than excluding them, because exclusion was impossible, at least for one. Well, the major powers, of course, took no notice of ZOFAN. The same year, two of the three littoral states of the Straits of Malacca attempted to deny the international status of that straits. The exception was Singapore, of course we didn't. Immediately, the US and the Soviet Union found a common interest in sailing their fleets up and down the Malacca Straits. And there was absolutely nothing the littoral states could do. China did not do so because China at that time had no fleet. I have no doubt that if China had a fleet, it would have followed suit. Well, my ASEAN colleagues were undeterred by this very powerful demonstration of the realities of international relations and proceeded on negotiations for a Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, which was intended to give effect to the zone of peace, freedom and neutrality. These negotiations were very long, they were very arduous. I must admit that it is Singapore who made them longer and more arduous because we refused to give in on a fundamental issue. But finally, our interests were assured, and there was the treaty was concluded in 1995 and entered into force in 1997. Our fundamental interests, for those of you who have an interest in nuclear weapon-free zones, were in Article 7 of the treaty that ensured that any state party, that's us, could unilaterally decide, allow the fleets of major powers, whether or not they were asked carrying nuclear weapons, to pass through the region, to call at use our facilities, to maintain, although not stated as such, a balance. In other words, once we were assured that the Treaty of Schonfest was harmless, we agreed to it. We then embarked on a protocol that would allow the nuclear weapon states, the original nuclear weapon states, to accede to it, the P5. Negotiations were again arduous, and we thought we were coming to a conclusion when at the 11th hour, 3 out of the 5 nuclear states presented reservations of a very fundamental kind to the protocol. And this despite the fact that the Sean-Fish Treaty in its Article 17 said explicitly is not subject to reservations. What lessons can be drawn from this? I'll wind up soon. First, the nuclear weapon states, 3 out of 5, but I'm sure the other 2 only did not present their own reservations because the other 3 had done so on their behalf. What lessons can we draw from this? First, they never intended to abide by the treaty and negotiated with us for other reasons. I don't want to speculate about what reasons they were, but obviously there were other reasons. And secondly, as I said, the 2 nuclear weapon states that did not present reservations only did so because there was no need for them to do so. The others had done so on their behalf. Reservations are of fundamental nature. They essentially allow any nuclear weapon state to unilaterally decide whether or not the treaty had been violated because of transits of vessels by other nuclear weapon states, and then free themselves from all obligations. This was unacceptable to us because East Asian stability was and remains resting on the US nuclear umbrella. And while this reservation may not be activated now, who is to say it will not be activated in the future? It was a fundamental security concern. Well, we still continue with discussions, we, meaning ASEAN, with the nuclear weapon states. I suppose there's no harm in it. There are other reasons for it, but that's not our way. Thank you.